Thank you, Mr. Singh. We are greatly honored to have with us today Mr. K Shanmugam SC, Singapore's Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Law. Minister Shanmugam will be participating in a Q&A session with Ms. Lucy Reed, the President of the SIAC Court of Arbitration. May I please invite Minister Shanmugam and Ms. Reed to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Shanmugam, for coming to join us in, as Devinder described, our family this morning. And thank you all for being here remotely, but also in person. And this allows me to say that the most common phrase I'm using now is not "you are on mute," but "it's so good to see you in person." Thank you. Now, I will have 3 or 4 questions for the minister, only one of which, well, that's a cue to you to start thinking of your own questions, because the minister has agreed to take questions from the audience, having explained to me a few minutes ago, or reminded me a few minutes ago, that, as Devinder said, the minister does have some authority here. And suggestions and questions you want to ask to him as senior representative of government can be followed by action. So please do plan to take advantage of this audience. But I'll start while you're thinking with a few questions, only the first of which requires any introduction, Minister, and Devinder did most of it for me. And that is that I often say, people hear me say that Singapore, in my view, is second only to The Hague in being a place, a jurisdiction that promotes international dispute resolution. And I even have a slide I use often that puts up the Peace Palace and the Singapore Supreme Court. And there's no doubt that much of this is a result of the critical role of government, as Devinder described, with first-rate courts, first-rate legislation, first-rate local practitioners, Maxwell Chambers, SIAC, SIMC, other things that have led Singapore now to be at the top, not just regionally, but globally. And I view it as a situation, having done this practice all my life, as Singapore having allowed this to happen, not making it happen, but allowing this all to development, which is very different than making it happen. So the question on our, well, and I would also say this fits in with the theme of the SIAC Symposium, which is co-creation and sharing ideas. So my question, and it's on many of our minds, is what next? What will be done? What should be done to maintain Singapore's leadership role in international arbitration and dispute resolution?
Thank you.
That's an
easy question for the first question in the morning at about 9+. I'll put it this way, Lucy and ladies and gentlemen. To me, I've always thought the law follows business. If there is no trade flow, if there is no business, no infrastructure development, we can do our best, but nothing much is going to happen. So the key is to scan around, look at what's happening. And if you look at Asia, I think a lot of people know, but you look at the numbers, trade flows, just under $10 trillion of imports, just under $10 trillion of exports. You look at investments, Asia Pacific, you're looking at $700 billion of foreign FDI inflows, maybe just under $600 billion of outflows. And Southeast Asia is one of the, I think, brightest spots in terms of the global growth in the next couple of years. So we had a tremendous opportunity, and COVID, in a way, has differentiated some places from others. I think Singapore is seen as one of those places that has handled COVID reasonably well. Good medical facilities, place where the rules are sensible, and where you are safe and your money is safe. And if you look around Asia, You need neutral places where you can arbitrate. I think it's no coincidence that half the top centers in the world are now in Asia. I mean, Singapore joined with London, but you also have Dubai, you have Shanghai and Beijing, and of course Hong Kong. In 5 of the, I think, top 10 centers, as Queen Mary would put it, in terms of preferences. Even within there, I think increasingly people also look at, which places in Asia, to what extent the government plays a supportive role, to what extent the government could intervene. And I think Singapore has an opportunity, the way I see it, post-COVID, to pull even further ahead in Asia. And so when I discuss with Gloria and Devinder, we say, look, what else can we do to make sure we may not be necessarily thought leaders, but we want to do things right. We want to do things well. We want to make sure that people automatically look at Singapore. And I think we are very well poised, but doing this things that we're doing very well. What is that? Continue to maintain confidence in our rules, in our courts, continue to make sure that Singapore is an attractive place, continue to make sure that people, arbitrators from everywhere, counsel from everywhere are welcome. Make sure that our institutions, not just SIAC, but the whole lot of other institutions which are here can perform, support them in that. And increasingly, hybrid alternate dispute resolution is becoming attractive. So arbitration, mediation, so supporting mediation. And SICC, the Singapore International Commercial Court, is also seeing an uptick. I think it's necessary support because of some of the questions that have surrounded international arbitration. Some situations, minority of cases, I think the confidence that there is a good court system, which would not be interventionist, but which you can go to with confidence, I think is important. And those are really the areas that we would continue to focus. And, I said to you just now, Lucy, that Singapore is one of those places. If somebody has an idea here, I can go back this afternoon and give instructions and it will be law in 2 months or 3 months. So that is the possibility that Singapore has. And it has happened when we have seen decisions say that we think applied the then law, but not consistent with how we wanted to see arbitration develop. We have changed the law in 2 months or 3 months. And earlier this year, we introduced conditional fee arrangements for arbitration. And we are continuing to look at whatever else that we can do to support. Thank you.
Thank you. So the theme is, I guess, continuation of what the Singapore government branches have been doing. We have some people who are competitive in the audience, Minister. So the first question, I'm not able to tap it, but the first question, which is from an anonymous person, is, in your view, will Singapore become the most popular arbitral seat in the world in coming years? And what steps can you volunteer might take Singapore there?
Look, I don't want to be in the business of predicting what's going to happen in the coming years. I mean, nobody predicted the war in Europe. And, things can happen. But the secular trend, in my view, for Asia is that business is going to continue to grow at a very fast pace. China, secular trend is upwards. Southeast Asia, secular trend is upwards. India is coming up. And Australia will continue to grow. So this whole region is, in my view, poised for continued growth, steady growth, maybe even good growth for the next 10 years. And I think you're going to see opportunities. We are really at an inflection point and opportunities that you haven't seen in the past. Subject to the minor issue of maybe a major war, But subject to that. And we would be, I think, incompetent in Singapore if we are not able to take advantage of this. Because if you look around Asia, I say, where would you go to for arbitration today? Where would you go to where it's easy to get in and out, where you trust the arbitration system, where you trust the court system, where you know that there is rule of law? There are places you have to be because of business reasons. But if we had a free choice, I think Singapore would be number one. And that's reflected in the fact that we now are jointly number one with London. I think we have a tremendous opportunity. Some of the things that we need to do is to make sure that our arbitral institutions, the physical facilities in Maxwell, are not just physical, but much more technology focused. So that's going to be a major focus, because people want now to be able to arbitrate from different places in the world without having to necessarily come into Singapore. So that's something where I think we are not where we quite ought to be. So that should be a major focus. Subject to that, it's really making sure that we keep in close touch with the arbitral community and do everything possible to make sure that Singapore converts its current perceived advantages into a real advantage.
Thank you, Minister. People don't believe this, but I'm personally not that competitive. And I like to think of SIAC as being the leader because of the quality of the work that is done. And I also see a lot of room for alternative dispute resolution, which you mentioned, and international mediation. So could you comment a bit on your perspective on the complementarity of what Singapore is doing with Mediation Center, the Singapore International Mediation Center, and other mediation groups here, and the International Commercial Court?
We see arbitration, of course, everybody knows about it. Mediation had been perhaps underplayed in this region, but we saw the need to complement arbitration really with mediation and international court system. So mediation, you have the Singapore Convention on Mediation, 2019, you had more than 100 countries turning up here. The first UN convention named after Singapore. We pushed it because particularly in Asia, but I think all over the world, people do want the possibility of having the right to go for an arbitration, but settling it through a mediation if possible. And so arbitration, mediation, arbitration. And the enforceability of mediation awards became important. So I'm glad to say, the Singapore Convention on Mediation is now in force. Enough countries have ratified. We would like more countries to ratify. And that's a major task that our foreign ministry together with our law ministry is undertaking, persuading countries to look at this. But, people have other priorities during COVID. But countries are beginning to come back and look at it again. The number of signatories, all the major trading partners have signed. So it's their legislatures now making it into a recognized law. So mediation I see as extremely important and complementary, and we want to replicate the success of arbitration in the mediation sphere. Top-class mediators, support for mediation, proper center. So the factors are similar. And I mentioned briefly about the courts. The confidence to know that there is an international court that you can go to, that counsel of your choice can appear. And the judges from many different jurisdictions, top judges, who will understand your law and who will be able to deal with the issues you raise. I think that's extremely important. You don't want every arbitration to go there, but you want counsel, you want our parties to have the confidence that in some situations they can turn to the courts. And I think when you come to the court system, Singapore has a particular advantage because we are not usually parties to these disputes. It's completely neutral and people trust that. So big role for these alternate pathways working together.
Thank you. For those who don't know, now all questions to do with international arbitration go to the commercial court judges. It's working very well. It's an important step. You mentioned the importance of arbitrations being able to be done in Singapore without people always traveling. It's not so much that SIAC works on, but more Maxwell Chambers is advancing the technology for ever better remote hearings than people sitting at their dining room tables. But this raises a related question, and it comes from Tariq Khan. What views do you have on green arbitration? Is the government doing anything to introduce practices to reduce carbon emission in arbitration? That probably also applies to litigation.
Honestly, it's not something that we have thought about in terms of discouraging people from visiting Singapore and reducing their carbon footprint in terms of air travel. But the Maxwell Board has very ambitious plans to convert itself into what they term as a e-dispute resolution city, a global center which you can access from wherever you are, and which would follow the latest sensible green policies, but also be extremely accessible. And it's a very exciting vision. They presented it to us, and I have said we fully support it. And the government has got to come into this and put some money on the table so that these initiatives can take off. So they're very focused on it. And I think the context of green arbitration is really to make it possible for people to arbitrate without having to have a huge carbon footprint. And Maxwell Chambers is very focused on that.
Thank you. I think we're all aware that we have to take many small steps to get there. I have back to one of my questions. Singapore has not had many, if any, at least publicly known, investment treaty arbitrations, whether by Singapore investors or against the government, but I'm sure it's on the minds of the government, the ministry. Do you have any perspective on how this field of arbitration is now developing?
I mean, we have been following the debate quite closely, and you know the arguments, the issues of sovereignty, the sense that government's freedom to act is being constrained by a very older perspective on how law is applied, and bad agreements are entered into, quote unquote, bad agreements are entered into, and governments affected, particularly in the developing world. There's a sense of grievance, injustice even, and perhaps reaction to the whole exit type arbitrations. We haven't been on the receiving end of it, and we are very careful when we enter into agreements. We do enter into agreements, I do, and we normally comply with our international obligations. So I don't think we have been taken to arbitration by anyone yet. So some tobacco company is thinking of taking us to an arbitration, I think, because we came up with some rules, and we are quite happy to go into that arbitration. But other than that, what it raises, and I've had chats with some people, and I've actually coincidentally had a chat with Gloria, I think a couple of weeks ago, to say we should form a panel of some leading experts to look at this question in particular, and one or two other questions. I mean, many of you here know the issues that have been raised in various fora about arbitrations and issues relating to conflict of interest. I don't see Singapore as necessarily a thought leader in these issues, but I think we ought to be very focused on and have a clear sense of where the arbitration community is going and the argument. So I've suggested to her some names of people whom she should approach and form a think tank and advise the government whether we ought to be looking at this. So very much in our minds. I don't know how many of you know, but the Chief Justice also spoke about this, I think last year or earlier this year. Very thoughtful speech, speaking about exit, and a couple of other speeches on how the process of arbitration now has become so complex. You're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of documents, and it's threatening to overwhelm the entire process. And whether that's really the way to go, are there alternatives that you ought to be looking at? And one or two other issues like that. And since I'm not the expert, I've asked that this be looked at and see where we ought to position ourselves.
Thank you. Here's a question. It may be too legalistic, but it's been asked to me many times. It goes back to the International Commercial Court. And the question is, international arbitration matters, as we know, are now being heard regularly by the SICC. The legalistic part is, could they be designated as offshore matters? But the main question is, could more be done to allow international counsel, in particular counsel who have been in the arbitration itself, full freedom to appear in the Singapore International Commercial Court?
It's been a process of evolution. I think many of you come from different jurisdictions where you know that the local bar associations are usually quite careful about who has rights of audience. So one council put it to me, there is a trade union called the Bar Council in most countries. And for us, it was a very big step. I remember Devinder spoke about it, 2008, 2009, in completely opening up our panel of arbitrators to make it international. In fact, appointed an Australian leading arbitrator as the chairman and opened up our court. And then, of course, laws on any counsel can appear, even with the matter involved Singapore law in arbitrations. The court's appearance in courts has always been a sort of sacred cow. In SICC context, we have opened it up for obvious reasons. And I think the request is whether we can open it up even more. My own view on the matter had been that it's fairly relaxed now. If it's an international matter, particularly if it's an arbitration matter, the counsel of the client's choice can appear. But I will go back and look at the question again.
All right. Now here is a question that takes us out of arbitration as we get to the end of the session. With the nationalistic tendencies of many countries and the escalation of isolation of major economies, mention China or Russia, how does Singapore remain neutral, relevant, and strong? This is the tightrope that I know the Prime Minister talks about often.
I should refer to his National Day rally speech. It's a question of how long you want to be here for on answer to this question. But the point is very simple. Yes, what are the major trends arising from what we call onshoring? Everybody talks about supply chain resilience. It's no longer just supply chain efficiency. Efficiency means you produce goods in supply chain wherever it's most efficient to produce and then integrate. But that model, after COVID and as a result of the war, now many people realize you also need resilience, which means having the products made at a place that you can rely upon, which may not be the most efficient way of doing it, And the United States is encouraging people to onshore, companies are onshoring. And many people are looking at, okay, where is our major manufacturing center? Often China. So then there is a China plus one. I think China, as I said just now, the secular trend is upwards. That's, if anyone thinks that that may change, that's wishful thinking. So China will continue to grow, but also Southeast Asia will continue to grow. India will continue to grow. And many companies, in fact, most companies will have an option. Whether it's India, they will have plus one outside. If it's China, they will have plus one outside. You will not put all your manufacturing capabilities in one country. You will spread it. Now that does Singapore a lot of good because business growth is in this region. And doesn't matter how it comes, doesn't matter whether it is slightly more fragmented, but people will choose to put their factories in this region. People will put their supply chains here because you want to sell in this region too. And Singapore is the place that's a leading service center, not just law, but various other services. And as a result, I see for us, we would be certainly relevant as long as we are sensible in the way we structure our policies. We will continue to be strong simply because we have rational economic policies and we generally have a budget surplus. And second, people know our economic policies are sensible. How do we remain neutral? I think the question there has been mistyped to neural, which may not be any relevant point. But neutral is a more difficult challenge because we may get to a stage where the two major countries, first and largest and second largest economies in the world, might ask countries to choose more clearly. And it's something that we'll just have to deal with when it comes.
Thank you. There are other questions here that I think are too technical about arbitration and mediation. Should we stop talking about alternative dispute resolution, but instead appropriate questions of time and cost in arbitration, which I think we will be dealing with in this symposium as we go forward. So I won't put them to you. But my last question will be, well, actually my second to last, will be to invite you to give any advice or thoughts to this audience of international and Singaporean practitioners of international arbitration as we head forward.
I think, this is an audience of experts, and I haven't done arbitration in 15 years, so I'm not sure I'm in a position to give advice. But what I would say is the arbitration has had a strong growth over the years, but legitimate questions have been raised. I think some serious questions on how the whole practice of arbitration, practice of arbitrators, counsel, how do you deal with conflicts? I think many different institutions are. And I think it behoves serious arbitration practitioners and in fora like this to take a hard look at the questions that have been raised, to make sure that the practice of arbitration retains the confidence of clients, and it remains a preeminent way of dealing with disputes together with mediation. And, and in all of this, there is a short-term view and there is a longer-term view. I think for the good of arbitration, these hard questions should be dealt with, and they should be dealt with in a way that ensures that everybody believes that it's transparent, open, clear, and you can have full confidence. I think the issues have been highlighted. They've been talked about. I'm not sure that enough has been done to deal with the issues. It's not so much for governments to deal with because, this is an international field. So really, it depends on the top arbitration professionals to come together and talk about it and deal with it. That's what I would say.
I can assure you that these questions of conduct and independence, transparency are on the front burner for all of us. We'll be talking about it at the court and board meetings tomorrow and here in the symposium. My last question is, it's not a serious one. Do you ever wake up in the morning and wish that instead of having all these heavy issues that you have as a minister on your shoulders, you could just be an international arbitrator? You don't need to answer. Because of course he would like to be what you are. No, seriously, thank you all for submitting questions and for listening to this interview, and especially thank you, Minister, for coming to meet with all of us as an example of the collaboration in Singapore between government and arbitration. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, and good to see colleagues again.